Okay, let's go ahead and look at Chapter 9. With Chapter 9, I'm going to review this a little bit differently with you all. I'm going to hit several key things that you should know as shown in key concepts, definitions, and formulas. And then I'm going to talk to you about two specific types of problems you should be able to solve from Chapter 9. And that's to help you streamline a bit your studying for this chapter. Okay, so basically what we're talking about here is inflation, treasury securities, treasury markets, and we have our definitions of inflation and things like that. And I am jumping ahead here on purpose because one thing you should definitely know in this chapter is the relationship between nominal interest rates here. This is the R that we know and love that we have been using all along, and our rate of inflation here and our real rate, which, as you can see for us, the real rate of your investment is your nominal rate minus what's eaten away by inflation. So we do want to keep this in mind and know how to use this. And so that's number one important takeaway from this chapter. Second important takeaway from this chapter is that treasuries are called risk-free, but they do have some risk, right? There are risks in treasuries. They have risk that is shared with any investment. That's duration risk. The longer treasury you buy, the more interest rate you would expect to get from that, because the farther out you go, the higher probability of a bad outcome there is, even for US government, et cetera. And then there are also risks here that are specific to treasuries, including inflation, interest rate, and default. So with all this in mind, we call our treasuries risk-free securities, even though we know that they have some risks, and we write our risk-free rate, which is really measured by treasuries, as R risk-free or RRF. Okay, so risk-free risk is going to be an important component of risk for the rest of the term, and it's measured typically by treasuries, but it does include duration risk, inflation, interest rate, and very small default of US government risk. And the third thing that I want to highlight for us in this chapter is the treasury yield curve. And that's a curve like this that is constructed from looking at a bunch of zero coupon treasury bonds that have different maturities and just plotting on a graph, put on the x-axis how many years to maturity, and put on the y-axis for each one their current YTM over here. And as we'd expect during normal conditions, this is, if we draw a line between all the x's, we get an upward sloping curve, and that's because the longer time we want to invest in a treasury security, even though it's pretty low risk, the more interest we want from that. And this shows us very clearly our duration risk for the treasury. So you can look at this curve and say, for a 3-year treasury, what's the approximate interest rate that investors require for that? And at this time two here, I'll focus on time two. At that point, it was about 5%. We could read over to YTM of 5%. Okay, and that is also our RRF on this graph. Okay, so with that, specifically for the exam in Chapter 9, you should be prepared to do these two types of problems. One problem where you're given a bank or somebody offering a deal and you want to find what the real rate of return is, or maybe I'll give you the real rate of return and ask you what inflation was at the time, or give you the real rate of return and inflation and ask you what the nominal rate was, that sort of thing. So this is taken from practice problems. We've got a video up with this exact problem. You can look at the Excel spreadsheet with a solution is also given to you. And the second type of problem you should know from Chapter 9 specifically is the type of problem that illustrates that Treasury securities and risk-free risk in quotes are not risk-free. So this is one of these problems where something changes overnight. And so we're assuming that risk-free risk is equal to inflation plus everything else that's measured in treasuries. And so overnight, so typically in a problem like this, I'll say to you, you've bought a bond like this, and overnight inflation doubles or something. So how much could you sell the bond for? So you've got to be able to go from the RRF when you bought the bond to the RRF the next day with the change of inflation, and then just apply the present value, future value formula to solve for whatever is asked for. So just make sure you can do these two types of problems as illustrated in practice problems for handout 9. And with that,
Mhm.
let's leave out the rest of handout 9, and I'll see you back here again soon.